Last time we spoke about the continued drive towards Moscow. In the autumn of 1941, a winter-thin road stretched from Leningrad to Moscow, with two vast armies looking at each other from either side. On one side, shells and steel, on the other, stoic resolve. Mud, Rasputitsa dragged wheels and tested men as much as enemy fire. The Germans pressed from the Ukrainian plains, chasing a swift triumph, while General Zhukov's Soviets rebuilt lines and held a stubborn defense around the capital. Cities along the road buckled under pressure, yet the Red Army stood shoulder to shoulder with civilians, brick by brick staving off encirclement. Bryansk-Vyazma glowed with brutal fights, yet the Germans found no easy path. The Red Army's manpower, once underestimated, surged back with veterans teaching newcomers, even as many units formed in the field facing shortages and fatigue. Kalinin became a crucible. Tanks clashed with captured bridges and muddy streets as both sides paid a heavy toll. Stalin's pressure and Zhukov's improvisation provided new fronts and counterstrokes, transforming despair into a stubborn, almost defiant endurance. This episode is the Tikhvin offensive. Well, hello again, and welcome back to the Eastern Front podcast week by week. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before I begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II and so much more. So go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. Over at Echoes of War, we're now finishing up a multi-part series covering the Japanese invasion of the Philippines during the Pacific War. Also, if you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. With Vyazma crushed, Army Group Center now pivots towards Moscow, while Army Group South presses on to seize Ukraine's industry and fuel. Yet weather grows harsher, and resistance thickens as Tikhvin and the Rasputitsa grind the advance to a halt. A northern offensive opens up, panzers are surging towards Tikvin and the last supply route to the besieged Leningrad. Between October the 16th to the 20th of 1941, the Germans are now racing to win before the Russian winter really takes hold. The disaster of Vyazma and Bryansk forces the Stavka to rebuild in front of Moscow, a rebuilding that comes at the expense of other fronts. The Fourth Army is reduced to 3 rifle divisions, 1 cavalry division, and 1 lone tank battalion, stretched over 50 kilometers with its only reserve being a single rifle regiment. All of the Fourth Army's formations are seriously under strength. Likewise, the 52nd Army is trimmed to 2 rifle divisions, exhausted and depleted, supported only by 4 artillery regiments and an anti-tank regiment, but with no reserve frontline formations, leaving the 52nd with the daunting task of covering an 80-kilometer front with minimal backing. In 9 inches of early morning snow on the 16th, the 21st and 126th Infantry Divisions are surging across the Volkhov, pressing against the surprised, thinly stretched and undermanned 288th and 267th Rifle Divisions. Behind them, the 8th and 12th Panzer Divisions moved with the 20th Motorized, carving a path through the white. 4 days of brutal fighting pushed the 288th and the 267th eastward, widening a breach that would expose the southern flank of the 292nd Division and left it shattered by a flanking hammer. With reserves nearly non-existent, the assault ripped a massive hole in the Soviet front between the 4th and 52nd Armies. Soviet reconnaissance again failed to warn of the attack. Again, the thinly held front line buckled at a weak point under a concentrated push. Again, there was no second defensive line to blunt the break, and no reserves able to counter the rush. The attack's principal aim was Tikvin, and the railway link between Moscow and Lake Ladoga, the last lifeline to Leningrad, a city that required roughly 1,000 tons of supplies daily even under rationing. Supplies were transferred over Lake Ladoga by slow-moving barges which came under frequent air attack. The same route carried the equipment and material produced in the remaining Leningrad factories to a broader Red Army. The region was dominated by swamps, lakes, and forests, a landscape that dictated every step of the advance. Dirt roads dissolved into the mud of Rasputitsa, rain and thaw turning passable routes into treacherous ribbons, with corduroy roads having to be laid down just to keep some wheels turning. This environmental grip did not merely slow movement. It funneled the fighting into the patchwork of settlements and hamlets scattered across these high-ground pockets. Elevated and dry, these spots offered strategic vantage points that controlled the surrounding routes, becoming indispensable nodes for maneuver and supply. Night after night, they offered respite from the cold, sheltering troops and equipment from the bitter wind as winter was pressing in. Sleeping in the open had once been a possibility in the brief warmth of summer, but as the temperatures began to plummet, bivouacs became lethal. Some Germans would share the shelter with the regular hosts, yet many would push the inhabitants aside with cold indifference, leaving people to face the night alone and exposed. From one Wehrmacht soldier named Wilhelm Brüller's diary, "You should see the act the civilians put on when we make it clear to them that we intend to use their sties to sleep in. A weeping and yelling begins as if their throats were being cut, until we chuck them out. Whether young or old, man or wife, they stand in their rags and tatters on the doorstep, and can't be persuaded to go. When we finally threaten them at a pistol point, they then disappear." Soldier Franz Frisch recalled, "When the first snows fell in early October, I could only think of the fate of Napoleon." Likewise, soldier Kurt Messener noted that the big drop in temperature affected men and vehicles. We had no warm clothing and suffered accordingly. We began to think of Napoleon's Grande Armée in the previous century. Leon Dugrel described the harmful effects of clinging mud before concluding, "We couldn't avoid thinking about the hundreds of thousands of men committed to the depths of Russia, who were going to try what Napoleon had not dared to try, to maintain themselves in spite of everything in the midst of the steppes, with the enemy right in front of them, the desert to their backs, and the snow falling from the sky." Blumentritt, Kluge's chief of staff, looked on nervously as the difficulties mounted alongside the historical parallels. Writing on October of 1941, he noted after the war, "And now the ghosts of the Grande Armée and the memory of Napoleon's fate began to haunt our dreams. Comparisons with 1812 multiplied. The civilian's misery deepens as winter's chill tightens its grip. Soldiers steal winter clothing to fill official gaps or torment the occupants for sport, adding cruelty to the daily hardships. For months, the German army had pressed deeper into the land, living off the land itself, snatching food and village stores with a parabolic efficiency of locusts, with weak logistics failing to keep the troops supplied. In the pale light of dawn and the long black nights, countless Soviet civilians would perish from exposure, random killings, or famine before the season's end. Captain Hans von Luck, who served as part of the 7th Panzer Division's command staff, noted the army was stealing warm Russian sheepskins to equip their motorcyclists and grenadiers, while the plight of Russian civilians, what they wore, if anything at all, remained unrecorded. Not only were peasant homes looted for winter apparel, but Soviet POW columns were also looted of their boots, coats, and any items of value. One account describes a prisoner transport in which the first 30 or 40 men were nearly naked and pressed together for warmth during the march. Max Landowski reported that even Russian deserters faced no mercy. Upon arrival, the German soldiers would strip them, hats, boots, coat, until the man would be standing there in his underpants. Then he was shot because, as Landowski noted, "The Russian couldn't have walked like that. He would have frozen to death anyways." Dead Soviet soldiers became a source of supply as well. Gottlob Biedermann recalled insulating their bunker with overcoats stripped from the enemy dead, including thick brown flannel gloves. Another soldier, Max Kühnert, dressed almost entirely in Russian clothing, a thick quilted coat and a fur cap, and he thought it made him look quite odd, but it kept him warm. However, that appearance could be fatal, for a post-war study notes that wearers often were mistaken for the enemy and they were fired upon by friendly troops all the time. On the 20th, Stavka issued an order that the 4th Army and the 52nd Army must seal the breach of the new offensive. In practice, the directive struck a discordant note. These two formations were barely clinging to their own survival, stripped of reserves and unable to muster any meaningful offensive action. Nearby additional Soviet forces stood in the region under a different banner, the 54th Army. Its composition was formidable by scale and scope. 6 rifle divisions, 1 tank division, 1 mountain rifle division, 2 tank brigades, and 2 artillery regiments, together accounting for roughly 70% of the Soviet strength between Lake Ladoga and Lake Ilmen. Yet rather than pivot to meet the German push towards Tikhvin, these forces were directed to pursue their own plan, preparations for an offensive aimed at Sinavino. The assault began on the morning of the 20th, but it yielded only token gains against dug-in German infantry, their positions bolstered by the stability of shelter and the brutal discipline of the front line. Despite many elements needed to conduct river crossings, none of the Soviet forces were prepared for such operations. They also found it extremely difficult to get the heavy KV-1 tanks across the river. By mid-October, Vyazma's battle was officially deemed finished. The German forces pressed on towards Moscow. The narrative amongst the Wehrmacht's leadership painted a picture of almost imminent victory, with many senior commanders convinced that the war would be decided soon. Indeed, that victory would arrive by October the 18th. One officer somehow took the rejection of their battalion's request for winter gear as proof that the war was nearly won. In that mood, claims circulated that after this point, the German army was instructed not to make further urgent requests for supplies of this kind, extending beyond clothing to winter necessities such as antifreeze or other cold weather gear. The rising realities of cold, knee-deep mud, and deteriorating conditions were effectively ignored, or even downplayed, in the propaganda and the planning. Joseph Goebbels stood apart from the feverish enthusiasm, nearly alone in his misgivings. He lamented how the term decision of war had permeated broadcasts, noting that the public's interpretation was closer to that of ending of the war than a decisive turning point. He understood that continued warfare would erode public support and damage the prestige of the Nazi state. Concurrently, an increasing number of Germans began turning to foreign radio broadcasts seeking perspectives beyond official channels. In Goebbels' 13th diary entry, it stated, "All that lay between us and the capital was the so-called Moscow defensive position. We had no reason to believe that this would prove a particularly difficult nut to crack." Free from their duties at Vyazma, the 46th Panzer Corps pressed on towards Moscow, yet contact with the enemy remained elusive, and the pace stubbornly slow, at best about 25 kilometers a day. The reasons were practical and harsh. Lack of up-to-date maps, muddy roads, and few suitable bridges to carry tank traffic. Fuel shortages driven by the muddy slog forced the corps to prune their fleet, discarding unnecessary or unreliable vehicles. The 11th Panzer Division faced a similar squeeze, compelled to abandon portions of its panzer regiment to ensure enough fuel for the leading battle group. Fuel constraints would shadow the Moscow advance as well. Then in an abrupt turn, the weather warmed on the 17th and the 18th, only to worsen the situation. Mud thickened into a watery quagmire, amplified by the heavy rain. Movement ground to a near standstill for days, as even the most straightforward advances became impossible. War Diary of the 46th Panzer Corps noted, "The Corps has serious concerns about the achievement of its orders because after careful study of these maps, the fact becomes clear that for this operation there is only one single road available. The Corps will be forced to advance with 3 divisions on this road, which from experience and the time of the year will be quite bad. As a result, the Corps will not be able to adequately utilize its striking power, but will always only be able to commit weak spearheads. Furthermore, the supply convoys will move only with great difficulty." One divisional commander contrasted the typical march discipline of a panzer division, normally spreading over 40 kilometers or so, with his own unit's extraordinary march footprint, extending roughly 300 kilometers. Advances were made despite the dire conditions. The SS Das Reich, aided by elements of the 40th Panzer Corps, managed to seize Mozhaisk on October the 18th in a 5-day battle. A report from Obersturmführer Gunther Hessing detailed what the soldiers of Das Reich faced. Built-in rows of electrically ignited flamethrowers, all sorts of tank obstacles, boggy streams, minefields, wire entanglements, bunker systems, steep slopes, and concealed force positions. The Soviet defenses were formidable, with concentrated defensive fire from artillery, flak, anti-tank guns, mortars, rockets, and machine guns. On October the 14th, Hauser, commanding Das Reich, was wounded and replaced by Oberführer Wilhelm Budrich. At that moment, Visch's 10th Panzer Division was engaging Soviet positions a few kilometers north on the historic Borodino battlefield, the same site where Napoleon faced the Russians on the 7th of September of 1812. It was one of the bloodiest confrontations of the era. A Das Reich report to the SS headquarters in Berlin summarized the situation. A rest of several days, where possible in warm and heated billets, is essential for the success of any new attack. The 57th Panzer Corps had not been at Vyazma, but its progress had been throttled when they had reached Moshchak's line on the 16th. The 20th Panzer Division, meanwhile, could only muster about 34 tanks in operation, awaiting the arrival of the 19th Panzers. Even then, 2 days of fighting and the loss of another 30 tanks was required to take Malayato-Slavets. The pace of the panzers slowed so much that the regular infantry of the 12th and 13th Corps could finally reach Mozhaisk's defensive line on the 10th. This was at the area of Kaluga, though these infantry divisions were already depleted. At Ticino, the 98th Infantry's battalion had fallen to about 190 men in combat strength after suffering 100 casualties and the loss of 5 company commanders during the town's capture on the 19th. Similar to the German advance on Kalinin, the Moscow drive was wasting its strength from within, an outcome of dreadful logistics that forced the panzers to cannibalize themselves to just keep on fighting. Vehicles were being abandoned due to a lack of spare parts for minor repairs, insufficient fuel to keep them moving, or just being stuck in mud and being unable to recover them. The Soviets also made sure to target key arteries to cripple their movement. Along the Moscow-Minsk highway, one of the few hard surface routes in the area, multiple delayed cratering charges were detonated daily, steadily hampering traffic and supplies. The already depleted 5th Infantry Division could not be retrained into a Jaeger division and was instead retasked on the 19th to repair and rebuild the highway. Its commander earned the moniker Motorway Dictator for his role in this crucial ongoing effort to restore mobility despite ongoing pressure. The pressures of this deteriorating supply chain reduced spearheads to weaker formations that had to resort to simpler, less sophisticated tactics suited to mud and scarcities. Instead of rapid maneuvers around flanks, the operations devolved into slow, grinding assaults, and even when a breakthrough did occur, usually came at a cost of far higher casualties. Compounding the situation, unlike earlier offensives, the Red Army had built multiple layered defenses in front of Moscow. Each frontal assault merely invited another, with no decisive breakthroughs or rapid advances on the horizon. More infantry were required to press the assault, but it would take time for the recruits to march up from the Vyazma battlefield. Even abandoning heavy artillery, the infantry could not overcome more than about 20 kilometers per day. Despite this accumulating evidence, the OKH still expected Zhukov's defenders to be rapidly swept away. In contrast, the OKW spent its energies debating the scope of the encirclement and the creation of an exclusion zone around Moscow. Meanwhile, Halda at the OKH entertained plans for encircling all the forces north of Army Group Center and establishing a line along the Vologda region before winter could close in. The 2nd Air Fleet had also fallen to about 269 sorties per day. This was quite a dramatic drop from the over 1,000 sorties seen at the start of the month, as weather was worsening. The Luftwaffe was operating from the most basic airfields with scant infrastructure to sustain their operations, leaving the VVS with air supremacy on many days across wide sections of the front. Airstrikes along slow-moving or even static targets became a priority for the Soviet Air Force, compounding the attrition already inflicted by the mud and the strained logistics. One segment on the road to Kalinin had over 1,000 bogged down in mud. It should be noted that despite later German claims that the Rasputitsa was not unusually severe, but actually below average in terms of the rainfall. The fighting around Kalinin intensified as the small battle groups from the 1st Panzers, the 36 Motorized, and the Le Brigade 900 were pressed into heavy house-to-house combat in the city. On the 16th, Bach subordinated Panzer Group 3 to the 9th Army, acknowledging that the Panzer Group was bogged down in a major battle and again reliant on the infantry army for support. That same day, Reinhard ordered the 1st Panzers and the La Brigade 900 to seize all available fuel and ammunition to push to Torzhok. The 36th Motorized was tasked with defending the city against continuous assaults. Yet the very next day, the offensive stalled at Mednoye, after advancing 30 kilometers. The Brigade 900, whose ammo was nearly spent, could only muster about 34 operational tanks. Ahead of them, the formidable operational group Batutin pressed forward, with additional Soviet forces attempting to cut off the division from its route back to Kalinin. The division was forced to retreat to Kalinin, but Halda insisted that the city be held as Soviet forces closed in from the north, east, and southwest. Zhukov moved Konev north in response to the German capture of Kalinin. On the 17th, Konev's command was reorganized into the Kalinin Front, and he was assigned the new 22nd, 29th, and 30th Armies. In addition, Operation Group Vatsutin and the 31st Army were subordinated to his command. The entire front maneuvered around Kalinin, launching continuous assaults against the Germans entrenched there. By the 20th, Kalinin was nearly encircled, leaving only a small corridor to the southwest. Some assaults even penetrated deep into the city before being repelled. The pressure was quite intense, with Bock describing Kalinin as a bleeding wound that would require strong infantry to seal. In response, the 56th Panzer Corps and 3 infantry corps were dispatched north to bolster the 41st Panzer Corps in the Kalinin sector. The logistical situation around Kalinin deteriorated to the point where an improvised airfield was quickly established to fly in supplies, even though it sat on the front line. Hans Rudel, one of the German pilots flying from the Kalinin airfield, had this to say: "The Soviets are attacking the airfield with tanks and infantry, and are less than a mile away. A thin screen of our own infantry protects our perimeter. The steel monsters may be upon us at any moment. We Stukas are a godsend to the ground troops defending the position. The ground personnel are able to follow every phase of the battle. We are well on the mark, for everybody realizes that unless the tanks are put out of action, we have had it." Still, the airfield could only deliver about 30 to 50 cubic meters of fuel per day, while a single panzer division typically required about 220 cubic meters daily. The nearest railway head was at Shivka, more than 150 kilometers away, and it would take several days for supply trucks to cover that distance. Panzer Group 3 received only about 200 tons of supplies per day from its railway head, insufficient to meet their daily needs even if it all reached the front. Supplying lines frequently traversed sectors of the front under constant attack, compounding these shortages. Behind the lines, partisan activity was also rampant. The chief of staff of the 9th Army was nearly assassinated in one such attack. Convoy protection was tightened around Kalinin, with heavy guards assigned to supply runs. In a rather desperate move, Panzer Group 3 ordered trucks to divert to Smolensk for extra supplies, but this yielded only a small net gain, and caused enormous wear on the vehicles. Trucks needed fuel to travel over such a large distance, which obviously would see them consuming the majority of their carried fuel supplies. This was the same exact problem facing the Germans in North Africa. And if you'd like to learn a bit more about that, you can go check out Echoes of War, where we have a 10-part mini-series covering that from mostly a logistical point of view, as it is one of the greatest examples of how logistics win wars. The Bryansk front began to unravel as the northern Bryansk pocket was officially eliminated by the 2nd Army on the 17th, and the southern pocket was closed by the 2nd Panzer Army on the 18th. Guderian's army had suffered approximately 4,300 losses in the first 20 days of October. This amounted to 45,643 casualties since the start of the invasion. The Bryansk front's death grip, though draining, tied down the 2nd Army and the 2nd Panzer Army for at least 16 days. While Soviet losses were heavy, they brought time for the Soviets to establish new defenses and to bring up fresh troops towards Moscow. The 4th Division became bottled up at Mitensk due to relentless Soviet attacks. By the 20th, it held only 46 tanks and about 18% of its ammunition. In several respects, the division's fighting power resembled that of a regiment more than a division. Nevertheless, the OKH and Guderian still expected to seize Tula, around 120 kilometers to the north. The division's only prospect lay in being reinforced by divisions redirected from the Bryansk encirclement. The 9th Panzers led the 48th Corps pushed towards Kursk, but had been stalled at Dmitriev-Ligovsky. By the 20th, its commander was openly protesting orders to attack. citing unguarded flanks, ruined roads, and the near-total depletion of combat power. Only 7 tanks remained operational, and in one motorized infantry regiment, merely 51 of 287 trucks were even functional. In a stark display of risk assessment, the OKH contemplated ordering the battered 48th Corps to advance more than 200 kilometers east to seize Voronezh, though such orders were not yet finalized. The 4 infantry corps of Guderian's army were creeping forward at about a kilometer per hour, as horses and heavy wagons sank into the mud. Infantry casualties of illness surged compared with that of the mobile divisions, and soldiers trudged through cold, waterlogged ground. Yet the Eastern Army's policies kept these troops on the front. Only severe illnesses could excuse a soldier from duty. On the 18th of October, soldier Harold Henry sent a letter home stating, "Our company went into the woods until we were over our knees in snow, which filled our boots, across frozen marshes that broke open so that icy water ran into our boots. My gloves were so wet that I could not bear them any longer. I wound a towel around my ruined hands. My face was contorted from tears, but I was already in a sort of trance. I stamped forward with closed eyes, mumbled senseless words, and thought that I was experiencing everything only in a sleep or a dream. It was like madness, agony without end. We were all more or less sick." These conditions were also killing the German horses. Many horses continued wearing summer shoes, contributing to frequent slips and leg fractures. Others died from sheer exhaustion after months of constant campaigning. Even for the survivors, forage was scarce, and many became emaciated. By November, only 65% of the horse-drawn transportation remained in the infantry divisions across the Eastern Front, even after replacement horses were sent. Panzer Group 3 was losing about 1,000 horses per day. The 53rd Army Corps had already less than half of its horses behind in Bryansk due to illness and exhaustion. Local Panji horses were attempted as replacements, but they were significantly smaller and weaker, unable to move the 105mm or the 150mm artillery pieces. In the muddy conditions, the requirement for draft horses to move each artillery piece then doubled, making it nearly impossible to relocate the heavy 150mm guns. Consequently, many divisions chose to leave their heavier guns behind to be recovered when the weather improved, bringing forward only a small subset of their lighter artillery pieces. They also could not haul the standard steel wagons used to transport ammunition and equipment for the infantry. As a result, lighter, smaller wagons had to be employed, drastically reducing logistical capacity. This served as a temporary stopgap, but could not substitute for proper artillery and supply trains. To worsen the situation, even though the Bryansk pocket had been officially closed, active Red Army groups and partisans remained dispersed, and supply columns came under constant attack, including by Soviet tanks that had been bypassed even earlier. The most damaging activity was the destruction of 33 bridges, creating a substantial reconstruction burden. Even by the 20th, several divisions remained tied down, dealing with the remnants of the Red Army forces. On the 18th, the OKH assigned new objectives for Army Group South. The 1st Panzer Army was ordered to take Rostov, and then push towards the area between Voroshilovgrad and Stalingrad. The 17th Army was tasked with clearing the area west of the Don and securing the northern flank of the 1st Panzer Army by capturing Stalingrad. The 6th Army received orders to advance to a line from Kharkiv to Novaya Katliva, and then towards Voronezh. The ongoing infighting between the OKH and Hitler would continue. The OKH favored enveloping the Kharkiv defenders to the west of the city with minimal forces, while Hitler insisted on a full encirclement and absolute destruction. Regardless of the approach, the retreating Soviet 38th Army outpaced the German units and eluded attempts for their annihilation. By the 21st, the Germans had closed in to within 6 kilometers of the city, and the 55th Infantry Corps was tasked with capturing it. After 2 months of besieging the city and suffering 98,000 casualties, the Romanians finally occupied Odessa on October the 17th, following the defenders' evacuation to bolster Crimea's defenses. The Romanians had failed to detect the evacuation in time to impede it effectively. Almost the entire coastal army defending Odessa managed to withdraw, though they were forced to abandon much of their heavy equipment due to shipping constraints. In total, about 121,000 troops managed to evacuate, along with roughly 20,000 tons of ammunition, 400 artillery pieces, and over 1,000 trucks. The 12 divisions that had taken part absorbed about 80% of the casualty rate. The Soviet withdrawal from Odessa left the Crimea defenders with numbers nearly double that of Manstein's 11th Army. Nevertheless, the assault began early on the 18th. 3 divisions of the 54th Infantry Corps had broken through across the Yuzhun line. The local lakes channeled these assaults into 3 narrow corridors. Also, as the ground was barely above sea level, most rapidly made fighting positions ended up getting filled with salt water. German artillery supported by Stuka dive bombers sought to suppress the significant Soviet artillery assets. Initial gains on the eastern flank soon stalled as Soviet reinforcements arrived, prompting Manstein to shift focus to the western sectors of the defenses. The substantial Soviet air pressure forced the Luftwaffe to redeploy many air groups from the 4th Air Corps to Crimea, reducing air support for other German forces across Ukraine. Yet by the 19th, German forces had pierced the neck of land north of Yuzhn. Casualties mounted due to sustained frontal assaults again against multiple prepared layers of defense. By the 20th, Manstein was begging for reinforcements, specifically panzer formations. He would only receive German divisions already engaged in the Odessa siege, and they would need time to march to Crimea. The 1st Panzer Army remained short of its objectives, but limited fuel supplies prevented any non-essential troop movements. The Panzer Army refused to place the Romanian 3rd Army under its command, citing coastal and rear security considerations. The decision stemmed from a dire supply situation that could not bear any additional strain on the logistical network. The 3rd Corps even sent a memo on the 23rd warning subordinate units to be prepared to survive on their own for several days. This suspicion of approaching scarcity had been growing since a catastrophic assessment of supply flows on the 17th. Conditions deteriorated further over time, culminating in the Panzer Army receiving nothing on the 20th. Rundstedt judged the army ineffective and in need of recovery time, yet the OKH did not share this assessment. Pressed to act on the 19th, it ordered the Corps to seize Stalino and Rostov, along with Rostov's bridges and fuel depots, by a surprise attack. The 49th Mountain Corps would capture Stalino on the 20th, only to find the city a ruin, having been scorched earth by the retreating Soviets. The SS Leibstandard had already secured Taganrog on the 17th to establish a bridgehead across the Meuse. There, the 3rd Panzer Corps prepared to assault Rostov, while the 14th Panzer Corps stood by in reserve to the north. This cautious arrangement reflected the dire reality that fuel was sufficient for only 1 Panzer Corps to operate at any given time. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. Over on Echoes of War, we're finishing up a mini-series covering the Japanese invasion of the Philippines during the Pacific War. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. The Germans hoped for a swift triumph, but Zhukov's Soviets rebuilt, brick by brick, holding the capital at a grueling pace. Kalinin burned with fighting. Bryansk and Vyazma bled. Civilians shared the cold, and their stories would etch in the frost with their fear. Battles raged across forests, swamps, and railway lines, destined to feed Leningrad. The Tikvin offensive has begun, and the struggle is now deepening.